The loudest sound inside the border jail was not the shouting. It was the metal doors slamming shut. Sirens screamed through the halls. Guards ran in every direction. Smoke filled the air. Somewhere in the chaos, a radio crackled with a message no one expected to hear. "Call the Mexican authorities." Inside the control room, an officer froze. For years, the two sides had worked near the same border but rarely together inside the same crisis. Now the situation was so dangerous that US agents were asking Mexico for help. Because the riot had grown far beyond the prison walls. And if it was not stopped soon, dozens of prisoners could escape across the border. But no one knew how the riot had started. Or why. 3 days earlier, the jail had been quiet. The Rio Grande border detention facility sat only a few miles from the US.Mexico border. It was not a huge prison, but it held people arrested for serious crimes connected to cross-border activity, smuggling, trafficking, and organized crime. Most days were the same. Doors opened. Meals were served. Guards watched carefully. Inside those concrete walls, tension always lived just below the surface. But on that morning, nothing seemed different. Officer Daniel Harper began his shift just before sunrise. He had worked at the jail for 6 years. He knew the routines. He knew which inmates argued and which ones stayed quiet. Most importantly, he knew when something felt wrong. That morning, he noticed something small. Too many inmates were whispering. When guards walked past, conversations stopped quickly. Eyes moved. Heads turned away. It was the kind of silence that meant people were waiting for something. In one of the holding blocks sat a man named Luis Mendoza. Luis had been arrested near the border a month earlier. He was quiet. Observant. The guards described him as calm, but calm in prison could mean many things. Luis watched everything. He noticed which cameras were slow to turn, which doors opened late, which guards worked overtime. But Luis was not planning an escape. At least not at first. Later that day, lunch trays arrived late. That might not sound important, but inside a prison, timing matters. Even a small change can upset the balance. Some inmates began arguing. One pushed another. A guard stepped in quickly, but the moment passed. Still, the whispers continued. Officer Harper walked through the corridor that afternoon with a growing feeling that something was about to happen. He stopped near Luis's cell. Luis looked up and said quietly, "You might want extra guards tonight." Harper frowned. "Why?" Luis hesitated. "Because people think something big is coming." Harper reported the warning. But prisons receive rumors every day. Most lead nowhere. Still, the supervisor increased patrols just in case. For a few hours, everything stayed calm. Too calm. That night, the first signal appeared. Lights flickered in one of the cell blocks. Then a loud bang echoed down the hall. A door had been forced open. Inmates rushed into the corridor. Another door slammed. Then another. Within seconds, the noise exploded into shouting. The riot had begun. Guards tried to contain the crowd, but the prisoners moved faster than expected. Some had planned this for days. Maybe weeks. They knew where to push. Where the locks were weakest. Where the cameras could not see clearly. Officer Harper shouted into his radio. "Lockdown. Lockdown now." But the control room was already overwhelmed. Doors jammed. Smoke spread through the ventilation system. And inmates flooded the main hallway. Luis Mendoza stood near his cell door, watching the chaos. He had not joined the riot. But he understood what was happening. This was not just anger. It was organized. And that made it far more dangerous. Minutes later, an explosion echoed from the outer yard. Not a bomb, just a heavy gate forced open. But the sound carried across the entire facility. Prisoners cheered. They thought freedom was close. Inside the control room, officers realized something terrifying. The riot was moving toward the border transfer corridor, a secure passage used when prisoners were moved between agencies near the border. If inmates reached that area, they could escape the facility and disappear toward the border. Stopping them would require more than the jail's guards. That was when the call was made. Federal agents were contacted. Border Patrol units were alerted. And for the first time during the crisis, someone suggested something unexpected. "Call the Mexican authorities," a supervisor said. Because the border was only minutes away. And if prisoners crossed it during the riot, neither country could stop them alone. Back in the hallway, Officer Harper tried to push through the smoke. He reached Lewis's cell again. The door had been forced open. Lewis stepped into the corridor. "You warned us," Harper said. Lewis nodded. "But you didn't stop it," he replied. Behind them, the crowd roared louder. More doors crashed open. The riot was spreading fast. And somewhere in that chaos, someone shouted a plan that made Harper's blood run cold. "Head for the border gate." Harper realized the truth. This riot was not just about anger. It was about escape. And if the prisoners reached the outer wall, the entire border region could face a crisis. Just as the alarms blared again, the power suddenly went out. "I'm going." When the power went out, the prison fell into darkness. For a moment, everything stopped. Then the shouting began again, louder than before. Emergency lights flickered on, casting red shadows along the concrete walls. The dim glow made the corridors look strange and dangerous. Smoke drifted through the air. Somewhere metal banged against metal. Officer Daniel Harper gripped his flashlight tightly. "Stay calm," he shouted into his radio. But calm was the last thing anyone felt. Inside the prison, inmates moved quickly through the dark halls. Some ran toward the outer sections of the jail. Others pushed doors open, hoping to reach the yard. The riot was no longer small. It had become a storm. Harper turned his flashlight toward Luis Mendoza. "You knew this was coming," Harper said. Lewis nodded slowly. "I heard people planning it," he replied. "Why didn't you say more earlier?" Harper asked. Lewis looked at the crowd moving through the corridor. "Because the people planning it, they don't forgive mistakes." Down the hallway, a group of inmates forced open another door. The loud crash echoed through the building. Some guards tried to block them, but the numbers were too large. One officer shouted, "They're heading for the transfer corridor." Harper's heart pounded. That corridor led toward the secure gate that connected the prison transport area to the road near the border. If the prisoners reached that gate during the chaos, some might escape into the night. And once they reached the border region, catching them would become much harder. In the control room, supervisors were already making emergency calls. Federal agents were on the way. Border Patrol units were moving toward the facility. And something else unusual was happening. A line connected to officials across the border in Mexico. The situation was now so serious that both sides needed to talk. "Are you saying prisoners could reach the border?" a Mexican officer asked over the radio. "That's exactly what we're saying," the American supervisor replied. There was a long pause. Then the Mexican officer answered calmly. "Then we'll send agents to the crossing points." For the first time during the riot, both sides began working together. Back in the prison corridor, Harper and two other guards tried to slow the crowd. "Back up," one guard shouted. But the inmates kept moving forward. Some were shouting with excitement. Others simply followed the crowd. In riots, fear and momentum spread quickly. Lewis stood beside the wall, watching carefully. He noticed something others did not. A small group of inmates were not shouting. They were giving quiet instructions. Pointing. Moving in a planned direction. Lewis stepped closer to Harper. "This isn't random," he said. Harper looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The riot was planned," Lewis whispered. "And those guys are leading it." At the far end of the corridor, a loud crash shook the building again. Another gate had been forced open. Fresh air rushed inside from the yard. The outside fence was now only a few sections away. The cheering grew louder. Some inmates began running. In the control room, cameras slowly came back online as backup power started. One of the screens showed a frightening image. A large group of prisoners was already moving toward the outer yard. "Stop them!" a supervisor shouted. But guards were stretched thin. There were too many people moving at once. Outside the prison, flashing lights began to appear in the distance. Federal vehicles. border patrol trucks, and even law enforcement units approaching from the Mexican side of the border. The cooperation had begun. Both countries were preparing for the same problem. If prisoners escaped, they would try to run toward the border. And no one wanted a chaotic chase across two nations. Inside the yard, the riot reached its loudest moment. Prisoners pushed through the open gate, shouting and running across the concrete. Some looked toward the outer fence. Freedom seemed close, but they did not see what was happening beyond the walls. Vehicles were already surrounding the area. Searchlights turned on. Helicopters approached. Harper stepped into the yard with several guards behind him. "Everyone stop," he shouted. But the noise swallowed his voice. Lewis stood beside him, staring toward the outer gate. "If they break that fence," Lewis said quietly, "this gets much worse." Harper nodded. And just then, a section of the outer fence began to shake. Someone on the other side of the crowd had started cutting through it. The metal bent. The wire snapped. And the first opening appeared. The broken fence rattled in the wind. For a second, the entire yard froze. Then the shouting exploded. Some inmates rushed toward the opening. Others pushed from behind, trying to get closer. Dust rose from the ground as people ran across the yard. To many of them, that small gap in the fence looked like freedom. But outside the prison walls, things had already changed. Bright searchlights suddenly lit the entire yard. The powerful beams came from vehicles and helicopters above. The night that had helped hide the riot was now gone. Every movement could be seen clearly. The cheering began to fade. Because the inmates could now see dozens of law enforcement vehicles surrounding the facility. U.S. Border Patrol trucks lined the road. Federal agents stood near the outer gate. And on the far side of the border fence, Mexican law enforcement vehicles had also arrived. Both sides were watching. Officer Daniel Harper stepped forward, raising his flashlight. "Everyone stop where you are," he shouted. His voice carried across the yard. Some inmates slowed down. Others looked around, realizing how many officers were now outside. The escape that had seemed easy minutes earlier suddenly looked impossible. Luis Mendoza stood near the edge of the yard, watching carefully. He had not joined the riot. He had stayed near the wall the entire time. But he knew something important. When large crowds panic, someone can get hurt even if no one wants that to happen. Luis looked toward the broken fence again. The opening was not large yet, but several inmates were still pulling at the metal, trying to make it wider. Inside the control room, supervisors watched the scene on the security screens. "Keep the lights on them," one officer said. Another radio message came in. "Mexican agents have secured the crossing points," the voice reported. That meant something important. Even if someone escaped the prison yard, there would be officers waiting on the other side of the border. The cooperation between the two countries had worked. Back in the yard, the helicopters hovered above the prison. The loud blades echoed through the air. Spotlights moved across the ground. One beam stopped directly on the damaged fence. The bright light made it impossible for the inmates to keep working. They covered their eyes. Some stepped away. Harper slowly walked toward the group near the fence. Other guards followed him carefully. "Step back from the fence," he said. This time, the inmates listened. They could see that the situation had changed. Escape was no longer possible. One of the prisoners finally dropped the metal bar he had been using to bend the fence. The sound echoed on the concrete. Another inmate raised his hands. Soon, others followed. The riot was beginning to end. Medical teams entered the yard first. They checked both inmates and officers to make sure everyone was safe. Then more guards arrived to guide the prisoners back into controlled areas. The smoke slowly cleared. The shouting faded. The chaos that had taken over the jail for hours was finally calming down. Inside the facility, investigators began asking questions. How had the riot started? Who planned it? Why had so many inmates moved at the same time? Those answers would take time. But one fact was already clear. The cooperation between U.S. and Mexican agents had helped stop a dangerous situation from becoming much worse. Later that night, Harper sat in the quiet control room. The alarms were silent again. Most of the prison lights were back on. Luis Mendoza was escorted past the window on his way back to a secure unit. Harper stopped him for a moment. "You warned us," Harper said. Luis shrugged slightly. "I didn't want anyone getting hurt." Harper nodded. Sometimes the smallest choices make the biggest difference. Outside the facility, the last patrol vehicles began to leave. U.S. agents and Mexican officers exchanged brief conversations before heading back to their posts. The border was quiet again. But everyone knew something important had happened. Two sides that usually worked separately had come together during a crisis. And that cooperation had helped stop a riot from turning into a cross-border disaster. As the sun rose the next morning, the prison looked almost normal again. The broken fence was being repaired. The yard was empty. The halls were quiet. But the memory of that night would stay with everyone who had been there. Because for a few hours, a riot inside a border jail had forced two nations to work together. And that cooperation had kept the situation from becoming something far worse.